today we're doing non-traditional tarot deck. Yeah. We'll see how people feel about our choices, because as always, very much inviting people to let us know, talk about it, share yours, etc. But essentially, Dawn and I are back for another round with 5 decks each, right? And we have both stuck to 5 decks as well.
Have we did good?
High five for us.
High five. I mean, it's helpful that I don't know where anything is right now. So it was a struggle for me to just find 5.
Yeah. And in fairness, you helped me select some of mine out of the 10 to 12 that I had on my list.
We narrowed. That's good. That's teamwork.
Do you have any initial thoughts from like going through them?
I think it was really interesting when I was, because first when you're doing any sort of, collecting a assortment of decks for any sort of theme, whether it's like something like this or a tag, like you kind of have to define what that thing is for yourself. Like, so I kind of had to take a minute and define of what does actually a non-traditional tarot deck, what does that mean for me? What does that look like to me? Because I'm guessing, as we found with previous videos, the idea of non-traditional, that phrasing varies from person to person. So we've definitely seen some of that in the comments, and it's really interesting. So like some of the deck choices we have probably to some people wouldn't be considered non-traditional because they have a different view of that.
Definitely.
For me, the kind of way that I categorized this in my brain was decks that kind of stepped outside in some way, shape, or form of the system of particularly Rider-Waite-Smith or Thoth. So they're still all tarot. That's a whole other discussion, but they're still all tarot, but in some way, shape, or form, they kind of step outside of the norm that we tend to see nowadays. What about you? What did you have to go through to select your decks?
Yeah, very similar. I felt like there were 2 factors that came up for me the most. The first one was the system. So how true it is to the system. And I think I'm particularly hyper aware of that based on having conversations in the past about decks that I definitely see as tarot and other people feeling that they weren't. And that's sort of surprising me. And when I think traditionally, I think part of that is what I understand other people's opinions to be, not just my own. But also I realized, I don't know if necessarily it's, for me, it makes it feel like it's not a tarot, but certainly I noticed that it's not considered traditionally a tarot. When the artwork deviates from what people feel familiar within the system, like that's definitely another layer for me. So if it was Rider-Waite-Smith, how far away is it from the Rider-Waite-Smith traditions? How much of the same story is it telling? That was kind of where I was landing between how does it follow a system, whatever the system is, and then the artwork.
Yeah, I think 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗎 was also in the back of my brain. It's like we were having a conversation about pip decks. Pip deck isn't like, it's, what is it? Not all 𝗕𝗿𝗎s are pip decks, but not all pip decks are 𝗕𝗿𝗎s. So that was also kind of in the back of my brain, but I don't have a lot of 𝗕𝗿𝗎s. I have a lot of pip decks, but we're going to do that a whole different thing. But that was also in the back of my brain, things that kind of step outside of kind of those, like the 3 main, right? You kind of have, I know that people categorize Thoth and RWS. A lot of people categorize as very, very different things.
Yeah.
To me, they're not. They all come out of the Golden Dawn. So to me, they're just different flavors of the Golden Dawn system. And then there's the 𝗕𝗏 system. And then there's what I call like the homespun system, where it's like people like me who just make up their own stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm going to call this a tarot. But because that's the way I was taught. So, which we've had multiple other discussions that we've talked about, but
yeah, which is funny because to me, I think because of that, especially when we get into that like numerology elemental facet, to me, that's still like, it's almost become like a legitimate system to me. But then I recognize it's technically not up there with the 𝗕𝗏𝗎, for example. It's not recognized. And I'm really excited to do the pip video at a different point. I have quite a plethora of pip-ish decks. Definitely a fun topic for another time. But so predominantly I'm assuming that our stuff is leaning towards Golden Dawn.
Yeah, all of mine would fit into that. And like, to be honest, every single deck I have picked, you could say is based around Rider-Waite-Smith. I'm going to argue, while I consider them, they're non-traditional, and maybe that's part of the key, is like, it's a non-traditional RWS, but like, some of them do go a very, very different way. I feel like for me, it's like when the artist, or the creator, I guess I should say, because the creator is not always the artist. They sometimes are two different people, but the creator clearly had a different sort of intention, is how I perceived it. Now I don't know these creators personally, so I'm projecting my own, my own ideas into that. But it feels to me, when I work with them, that the intention, or at least the intention that I work with, is not aligned with the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith or Thoth. So thus I consider them non-traditional, because they step outside. So like, on the flip side of that, what do you, like, before we get into the non-traditional, what do you consider a traditional, like, in your collection? Like, what would be a traditional tarot?
I feel like if it's familiar enough, which is a really loose way to define it, but is how I define things, because I'm a bit floopy with that stuff anyway. So it's like, as long as it feels pretty familiar and it sticks to the structure, because we know, like, from the Rider-Waite-Smith, if you're going to compare it to sort of Marseille, you get into quite a bit of contradictions between some of those. So as long as it sticks fully to, say, the Rider-Waite-Smith, so I might choose something like the Mystical Cats Tarot, which it does do things like it renames the suits by the elements, and it tries to, and effectively, I think, depicts the Rider-Waite-Smith messages, not in that complete clone way. There's still a lot of love and connection in the Two of Cups. There's still someone doing something mildly sneaky looking in the Seven of Swords. Like, it's attributing itself quite obviously to that. And then I think some decks, which they're probably not as non-traditional as the ones I've selected, but you've got like the Witch Sister, doesn't do that. There's enough of Rider-Waite-Smith familiarity in there in some parts, and then other parts it sort of deviates. So I guess it's more about, if I think that the pictures do a good job of representing the Rider-Waite-Smith or the Thoth imagery and to a similar meaning, that for me then is a traditional deck, because even if it's not a clone, it's following suit with their agreed story, their agreed message. What about you?
Yeah, I think really the same. It's if the imagery is recognizable, and I could apply the common, or the sort of universal Rider-Waite-Smith or Thoth meaning to that card without it being a stretch. Like, I can look at that and know that, you're seeing, let's do the dreaded Three of Swords. You're seeing that it's the RWS version of the Three of Swords, and it's going to relate to heartbreak, right? Like, if you see a Three of Swords, it doesn't matter if it's like a mechanical heart with swords through it, or a I don't know, little felt tipped heart with three swords through it. You still immediately, I think, make the correlation between that's a Rider-Waite-Smith Three of Swords. It's not a Thoth Three of Swords, because that looks totally different. But it's, in a way, like taking Pixie's art and reimagining it through different lenses. That's how I view it. If it takes the original art and meaning and just reimagines it through a different lens, then that to me is a traditional based deck. That's kind of how I see it. It's really recognizable. I wouldn't, I wouldn't need a guidebook to tell me what that card means.
Yeah, and that's beautifully put. And if you were a beginner, I think with some of those decks, you would still, even though it's not showing the Rider-Waite-Smith art, you would be able to get a Rider-Waite-Smith book and read the deck with it, and they still make sense together.
Yeah, I just thought it would be fun to just, kind of like, let's talk about what traditional is, because I think when you're looking at determining what is non-traditional, you do have to know what your definition of traditional is then, because what my definition of traditional is going to be different than somebody else watching who's going to be like, no, that deck is completely non-traditional for me. which is fantastic. Like, I think that's great. It's what makes having so many decks, you know, across the community so great, because we all get to see it through these different lenses.
I wanted to choose the most non-traditional out of all of them, and then you're sort of trying to almost make like a list of how many non-traditional points does this one hit versus this one. And so, like you say, you have to have the opposite, so that you can say, well, this does do that, but it doesn't do that.
It's like you have to know what bad feels like in order to understand good, right? You know, that's kind of a morbid way to put it, but like still, like it tracks.
Yeah. Should we take turns? And
yeah, let's take turns. Do you want to start with like the one that we kind of agreed upon that is like the quintessential?
The discussions that have been had about this deck, but I feel like people are not going to be surprised that I've picked this one up at all. But I am equally blaming Dawn for this choice, because this was a shared decision.
Because I was like, I have it too, but we only need to show it once.
The Wild Unknown Tarot. I'm sure that people have seen this till their eyeballs have fallen off, basically, because nowadays it's more, people are more surprised if you haven't seen it.
Right. Yeah. The little deck that has created so much discourse.
Hasn't it? What a powerful thing to have done, though. Like, I feel like this makes it, and when I say stand out, I don't mean like stand out, everyone has to love it. I mean, it feels like a significant deck in tarot history, based on not only the thing that it did that other people hadn't done at that point, but the responses.
I think that was key for me in terms of like when we were talking about this deck as being sort of the quintessential, because the discussion around that deck in particular, that I think is, we don't tend to talk about decks. That's kind of a little non-traditional thing in itself.
Yeah.
To have that kind of discourse around a deck.
And I think actually probably one of the most traditional depictions in it, which is still a little bit away from a traditional, but it is this one. I understand that people don't agree with me on this, and it's okay, but I am going to say it. I stand by the fact that ரிder-Waite-Smith has still infused and been a part of Kim Cran's creation based on the way that she discusses some of the cards. There are still obvious nuances between the 𝗨 and the ரிder-Waite-Smith, and this deck certainly leans towards some of the more ரிder-Waite-Smith ones between the imagery and the discussion in the guidebook, although the discussion in the guidebook's very, very brief. The cults in particular were a whole thing.
That was a huge challenge for me.
Yeah, maybe you talk to that, because I feel like that's probably a more familiar part for me. I feel like I was a bit luckier in that instance. What happened with you and the cults? I mean, I know, but...
Yeah. I didn't know what to do with the courts. If you don't know about the animal and you don't know the sort of symbolism and meaning behind the animal, and then trying to assign that to a court card, there was a huge disconnect for me with that, because I don't actually work with animal energy in that way, or at least I didn't at the time, for sure, when I first got it. And I was like, I really love the artwork because it was very different than anything else I had seen. It's a very distinctive style. Now there's a million of them out there that are in that same kind of style, but it was a very distinctive style when it first hit the scene. It was a deck that made me sit up and take notice. And I was like, oh, I should love this. I should absolutely love this deck. But when I got it and started using it, I think I've actually made several videos over the years with my transition with this deck. Then I finally kind of figured it out fairly recently. I think it was the courts that really threw me the most, because they, in comparison to every other deck that I had, they were so non-traditional.
Yes.
Because it's an animal. What do you do with an animal as a Queen of Swords or a Daughter of Swords, or, Son of Swords or whatever? And there's also like that, right? There's that language too that can trip people up, but is definitely the animals in the deck, because I feel like that was the first deck that I had where the animals were the predominant thing on the card. I'm used to seeing decks with like animals in them, and maybe the animal is a side note or a footnote in the overall meaning of the card. But in those cards, it's really just the animal and like, and the suit emblem, right? The sword or the wand or whatever. I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to interpret that. How do I take animal energy and apply it to me? This was a totally new idea for me, and it really, really tripped me up. But the whole idea of using an animal to associate what we have traditionally associated, we just did the court card one last time, with something that's traditionally associated with people, very significantly people, even in the Marseille people, right?
People, personality,
people's personalities, that kind of thing. And then to totally shift gears and like apply it to an animal, I was like, that's really weird. What are you doing? I don't like this.
And the thing is that the book doesn't do, and I'm just showing a couple more because if anyone doesn't know the decks, I don't want to assume everyone's definitely seen it. Like,
so I mean, there are people who are new to tarot that are coming in, and
all of the wands are snakes, all of the swords are owls, all of the cups are swans. And I think the thing was as well is that it doesn't talk about why the animals were chosen. This is a deck, like Dawn said, all animals pretty much throughout, aside from a few cards which are very pippish, whether it's leaning more to Rider-Waite-Smith or Thoth.
See, those were good. I was good with those. I was like, I get these.
And then you go into it and you're like, okay, well, there's a swan on here. So what do I do with that? And there's zero mention of it. And I remember people having feelings about it, which I totally understand. And
the guidebook does not do anything to help that deck.
It does not, dear. No. I don't know why I forgot that.
Yeah.
And I think the thing for me, which was the clincher, and it's really funny because I've spoken about this deck a lot over the years as well and had many feelings about it and experiences, even though it's one of my favourites, because actually it's far easier to read it now for me as someone who works with numerology, elements, animals, and colour. Couldn't pick a more perfect deck for me.
Right, yeah.
To be honest. But when I came back into tarot land and I had bought this, I had decided, oh, there's this thing that's Rider-Waite-Smith that everyone's talking about, because bear in mind, whilst it might be more common now to hear a lot more people say Thoth and Marseille, it wasn't as common as in comparison to Rider-Waite-Smith, not in books, not in people's language. And so even though I will argue now that there is enough Rider-Waite-Smith in this deck that I think it was definitely at least one of the systems that influenced her, I tried to learn the Rider-Waite-Smith with it, and it was terrible.
It's a terrible deck to try to learn with.
It was horrific, and I tried and I tried, and I thought it was me. And in the end, I remember talking to a few people in the community, specifically, I think it might have been Lionhearts, actually, who I've known for a long time on Instagram. And that's when I got my Mystical Cats Tarot, because I'm defiant. And rather than just getting a Rider-Waite-Smith clone, I was like, no. But that is how I learned Rider-Waite-Smith with that deck. And so there is inherently a huge part of this that couldn't do it for me, that was able to do. And I think that it's not very scenic. It does tell a story, but again, it's relying on you to read into, what does this mean, this butterfly coming from the he's not going to tell you. And this, if you don't know anything about the wands or
the number
or even wands, because it doesn't say, like, then you are going to have a very concise experience from the book and be like, oh. And I do think that this one is, like you say, I think you said quintessentially, it came and it was like, I'm going to do this different.
It shook things up. It shook things up. And it's so interesting to me when I hear from people, because that deck also, I think, really started to make this shift. And there are people, I'm sure, who argue this with me, and probably people who know better than I do, like, for being honest. But from my perspective, that deck was where we started to see the shift into more mainstream in tarot.
I
You can
agree.
buy that deck at Urban Outfitters.
Yes, and it was, I think, the first time we saw it at Urban Outfitters.
I think so. It definitely was like the first deck I ever saw at a retail shop that wasn't a bookstore.
Yep.
And for me, that was like, oh, this has really gone mainstream now, because now you're marketing it to people who know nothing about tarot, right? And the funny thing is then I hear people, this was their first experience with tarot and this is their first deck. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for you, because you are not getting a proper tarot education with that deck. Yeah. I do appreciate that deck. I really enjoy working with it now. It's taken me a long time to get there, but please don't make it be your first deck.
Yeah.
Get a real deck based on one of the main systems that you will be able to find more resources on, is really all it is. Because that deck, if that's your first and you're trying to work with that alongside, like, say, 78 Degrees of Tarot, you know, like one of those quintessential tarot books, you're going to be so confused, I feel like. And if anybody in watching back has actually done it, please let me know your experience, because like I would really be interested to know, because I feel like that would be doing a disservice. And again, nothing against the deck, but that would be doing a disservice to your tarot practice to be trying to learn on that deck.
Yeah, like you can learn to read with it, but it won't necessarily apply that system or a recognizable system to another deck. And so it stops that.
Yeah.
It's easy to expand onto this, but to take this and then translate it into the others. Yeah. And as I say, whilst I was very familiar with tarot, I had a very specific way of reading it.
Same.
When I tried to learn it, I remember I was reading Biddy Tarot's blog, I think, which was very recommended as like a 𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗎 blog. I also had Kitchen Table Tarot, which was like a nice, more concise, more modern book that I enjoyed. And neither of those helped with dealing with the wild unknown. And I think it stretched out my learning process of the 𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗎, because in the end, what I was trying to do was use the 𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗎 traditional imagery, which I refused to buy. So that was in the book. And then get the Mystical Cats Tarot. And then after a while, I would start bringing the wild unknown back in and trying to make connections. And you can, which is why I argue that you can find it in there if you want to, most of the time, not with the course so much, definitely. Yeah. But it wasn't easy. And so it almost felt like trying to learn two languages at once instead of just one. Definitely.
Yeah, I could totally see that. Yeah. Like, I mean, I think it's great. Like you said, it's a great deck to expand into, because it's very open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Especially if you're like tossing out the book and not looking at it, it's very open to interpretation. And so I think that's a great one to expand into. But if you don't kind of have that foundational knowledge to kind of pull from, I would think it would be really difficult to like learn off of that. And none of the references, like the mainstream references or the sort of foundational references of modern tarot, aren't going to speak to it, because you're going to be getting Pixie's art or you know, Harris's art if you're working with the Thoth, which isn't as common, but there's definitely, you know, books and stuff related to that specifically. But it's an interesting one, because it's got so many different elements to it that are like questionable. Like you said, like you can find it in there if you're looking for it, but like, honestly, if you're looking for it, you can find anything you want in anything, right?
Exactly.
Like you can make the cards tell you exactly what you want them to tell you, if you're just only going to read them that way, right?
Yeah, trying to turn your intuition off with that deck is the opposite of useful.
I'm guessing it would fall really, really flat.
It works great for that level, but not so much. What one do you want to start off with then?
All right, let's start off with, I've got the Ritual Tarot. I have to find my camera. So this one I chose for a couple of different reasons. One, it's collaged, which is kind of, it's more common nowadays. But if we're talking about like how decks were traditionally made, right, they were usually drawn. So the collaging is kind of a little bit of a nod to the non-traditional, I think. But this one it's kind of like with the Wild Unknown, like you can find the Rider-Waite-Smith in here if you're looking for it, but I don't think it's what's on the forefront of this particular deck. And also this one, because this is the first edition, there's no titles. So that in a sense is non-traditional, because you have to, and because we're not working with traditional imagery, like, do you know what card that is? Like, that's the whole thing, right?
Which is interesting because I don't know this deck. So to me, I don't know whether that card was something to do with the Hierophant or whether it was a swords card otherwise because of the brain intellect facet. So yeah, it's
interesting. I think it's more kind of like you could actually kind of make it, except for some of the things that they're like, you know, however many swords, right? Yeah. And it's interesting because this one, even though it's like, I still consider it a tarot, there's 78 cards, there is a structure. If you get into the guidebook, it definitely does, you know, tell you what's what and why it is, right? And it's the guidebook's really great. But the imagery is not like that readily recognizable, and there's no title to key you into it. So I think it's a great example, and it's collaged, and that's different. It's not drawn. So you're kind of getting all of these different elements coming together. And in a way, I think even more symbolic imagery to play with, because there's so many different elements, and you could probably key into things that maybe the creator didn't even necessarily mean to be a symbol, and it ends up being one in this deck. So I just thought this was an interesting one for kind of those different little levels.
It is, and I feel like some of the majors in that and some of the courts in that, I'm clearly looking at them and I'm like, is it this or this? So there's definitely like a crossover.
Yeah, when you're getting to know it, for sure, there's definitely like, the numbered cards are much easier because like there is like 5 swords on the 5 of swords. Yeah. There's 3 cups on the 3 of cups, right? So you can literally sit there and count the emblems and go, okay, that's what that card is. The majors and the courts, though, because there's no titles and because they don't necessarily reflect the traditional imagery, can be very hard to tell each other apart. And I prefer the first edition without the titles, because it makes it more open for me. I don't even feel like, one of the things that I also really like about that deck with it not having the titles, and kind of another thing that makes it non-traditional, is I could use it as an oracle.
Yeah.
So I could totally throw out all of the tarot associations and just work strictly intuitively off the art and completely discount the fact that there is a tarot structure underneath it if I so choose. And that's not something I could do with like an RWS clone.
Yeah.
I would look at that and go, I know that's the 5 of swords. There's no way else for me to see that. Like, there's no way else for me to intuitively interpret that. And now I can have nuances around the meaning of that for me, particularly with the majors and the courts in that deck. Like, you could totally discount any of the tarot and use it as an oracle, which is always fun. And that's definitely a practice I enjoy doing as well sometimes, just to shake things up. Like, and it's a great intuitive exercise.
Yeah, it's quite freeing in that way, isn't it? And like playful, because the card that I ended up hyper focusing on was the one with the brain sort of.
The brain, yeah.
And I'm like, that's still really memorable to me. Like, I'm still thinking about it now and like, oh, it could mean this and it could mean this. I think that they're really fun, like you say, for intuitive practice and exercise. I like how you brought the collage into it, because I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, you wouldn't have seen collage decks. So.
Yeah. Definitely, that's more of a newer thing. I mean, we have, things like the Voyager Tarot, which was, from a couple decades ago. But even that, in the history of tarot, that's still new, right? We're talking about a few decades versus a few centuries. So,
yeah, especially because it moves so fast now, right? So, like, it's kind of funny for people to be like, talking about things like the Voyager Tarot as an example and be like, yeah, it's a really old deck, hard to get a hold of. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's really not.
It's still a modern deck in comparison. Yeah. We look at these decks from like the 70s and the 80s and we go, oh, those are vintage. Those are old, right? But in the grand scheme of tarot, they're really not. There were still more modern decks.
In that case, I will pick the collage deck that I have. This is the again debated Lioness Oracle Tarot. I freaking love this.
That's one of my favorite decks.
The only reason I don't use it more often is the size. It's literally the size. And whilst I love the size, I don't feel like it couldn't have been done on traditional tarot. Like, I appreciate all of the glorious background, but I definitely could have had it cut down and had a hand-friendly copy. But this is nothing like what people were used to seeing. I mean, this is the Page of Wands. Cat, Rose, it's not gonna do that for people. I mean, the Two of Swords has two people in it. Like you say, already we're in an art form that's not common, but we fall into this interesting and even the, I suppose, the juxtaposition between its like space and then everyday culture or flowers, because I feel like there is several cultural influences in it in particular. They don't even talk to each other. Oh, it's my favorite card. I wish there was less glare, but this absolutely cracks me up. This is like a vampire dude and then a scared cat.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorites. It's so great.
It's so great. Good. And so I feel like you can get there, like you say. Not only does the book do a lot better of a job, in my opinion, than the Wild Unknown.
Wild Unknown, yeah.
And it does the astrology layers as well, because that's how Alejandra works with the tarot. But for the Nine of Swords, if we think about the Rider-Waite-Smith and we think of nightmares, it's chucked in a vampire. They're meant to be scary. There's red mist. The cat looks scared.
The cat looks scared, yeah. You can get there, absolutely. Yeah. It's not as on the surface, though, for sure.
No. And then Dawn and I were talking, and this is, I will own this. This is a pet peeve of mine. I don't know if it's a pet peeve of anyone else's. And not because I care how people experience something, because I think that's totally viable. It was more that people were saying that it wasn't a tarot deck because it had Oracle in the name. And that was her sort of saying, it's a tarot Oracle. And actually, it's the same as me calling it Cosmic Creepers Tarot.
It's the creator's name.
Oracle, yeah.
Yeah, so it's the creator's name. Yeah.
And I thought it was a really funny one because it was being put in with decks that were like Dreams of Gaia, which is obviously heavily debated because it doesn't stick to the 78 system. So it's
which we didn't include because neither one of us own. We're aware of it. We're aware of it.
As being a heavily debated deck because of that very reason. And actually, this is 78 and does follow the system, but is so out of the box again in its like glorious representation. I guess one of the things for me about non-traditional, which I'm now thinking of, I wouldn't say to someone if they really had their heart set on it, don't get the deck if you're a beginner. But for me, non-traditional decks aren't great beginner decks if a beginner is, again, looking to start with a system. Like, again, this one is going to take you a lot further away than any Rider-Waite-Smith book is going to be talking about. Surreal, isn't it? It's quite weird. Like,
best. Like the first time I saw it, like just online or whatever, I was like, that is really interesting. But I don't know, because it doesn't on first glance really follow the imagery. I won't say it doesn't follow the system, because it does. It doesn't follow the imagery. So the imagery is so its own thing that I was like, I don't know if like if that's something that I could actually work with within, in a really, interesting way. And then I got the opportunity to actually like see it in person and play with it at a friend's house. And I was like, this is an amazing deck. And then I got it, and like, it's been a favorite of mine. It has a very distinct sort of energy and personality to me. It's got its own persona, which to me, that also, I guess, leans really heavily into non-traditional for me, because if it starts to kind of have its own personality in a sense, then that no longer feels like it's echoing Waite and Smith, or Crowley and Harris. So it's got a different sort of like cadence to it. It's still speaking the same language, but it's got a different accent, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one, and I don't think she actually speaks about the artwork too much, but the guidebook
I don't think so, but the guidebook is good.
So what's your number 2?
So let's kind of stick in the, I guess, maybe somewhat collage-y. Although this deck is, while it kind of has a collage-y feel, they were actually like handmade dioramas. So I chose the Mysteries of the Black Madonna. Oh, this way. Or the any of the decks like these. And the reason I chose this one is because I, down deep in my soul, feel like the tarot is second in this. I feel like the tarot can be completely lifted out of this deck, and this deck functions beautifully. That's actually my preferred way to work with it. I completely ignore the tarot association. So I read it like an oracle, but it is a tarot. It has the 78 cards. All of the associations are there. Again, the artwork is depicted in a way that is, not in alignment with what we traditionally see as the as our imagery for things. So like if they're not titled, maybe you wouldn't even know it. The suit names are all different. Like it's just done everything different that it could possibly do different. Guidebook is part of the magic of this deck. The guidebook speaks more to what's going on in terms of the Black Madonna and the scene. It does loosely tie it back into tarot, but for me, and I don't mean this as any sort of disrespect to the deck or the creator, because I think it's freaking fabulous, the tarot feels secondary. It feels like the images were created. Again, I do not know this creator. I don't actually follow their work or anything. In fact, this deck was gifted to me. So like there's that. I didn't even purchase it for myself. It was gifted to me. Now, like I absolutely love it. But I feel like the tarot is completely secondary to that. And that's non-traditional in my opinion, because if you can lift the tarot out, the structure's still there. So it's still a tarot by my definition. It has all 78 cards in the correct order. They've been renamed, but like it has all of the elements, and they're there if you want to, find them. You can find the Rider-Waite-Smith in them. These are so open to interpretation. You could probably find Thoth in them if you wanted to too, but it feels secondary. And I mean that in the best possible, like loving way, because that is one of the things that I absolutely adore about this deck is that I can use it both ways. If I want to tie the tarot in, it is there, but I am not locked into it. It's like my whole thing with like guidebooks with oracle decks. I want there to be a guidebook, but I don't want to be beholden to the guidebook. And I feel like this is like a tarot thing. The tarot's there, but I'm not beholden to it. So if I'm feeling really rebellious and I just want to throw the tarot out the window, most of the time I work with that deck, I use it like it's an oracle. I put it in the center, like I always do with my oracle, and I pull tarot around it. And I work with the story of the Black Madonna that shows up in the card. I do the same with the Mysteries of Mary deck as well. But I feel like because the tarot feels secondary to me.
Yeah. I can really see it. And I don't own it, but I'm aware of it. I've heard very good things. That's probably, I'd have to say, my favorite of all of hers in particular, because I like the colors and stuff as well.
Oh, yeah, it's my favorite too. It's the one I use the most.
It has a very, I know it's not the Ritual Tarot, and the Ritual Tarot is something else, but it has, to me, in itself, a very ritualistic energy about it. And I can see it as almost, do you know what it reminds me of? Not visually in any way, shape or form, but I feel like if I had it, from what you've said, from what I've seen, it reminds me of how I work with the Wild Unknown Archetypes deck, which is back there somewhere. It's like, it is an archetype, it is an energy, it is like this raw primal presentation of something ritual, altar-like, and then you pull the other stuff and you have a conversation around it.
Yeah, I could totally see that. I feel like it was definitely like a labor of love. And I'm not like saying that when the creator created it, like they threw the tarot in secondary, right? I'm not insinuating that at all, because I actually do not know the creator's process around it. To me, the way I work with it, when I say the tarot is secondary, I mean that the power of the deck comes from working with the Black Madonna energy on the card, not the tarot association. So just want to make sure like I'm not crapping on the deck or the creator. I love it. I think it's great. But that's the way it feels for me. And when you read the guidebook like is beautiful, and it's got so much rich information about the scene that's being depicted in terms of the Black Madonna. And then there is the tie into the tarot. I don't know that there are a ton of decks that I feel like do that, but I do have a few decks that I definitely read like oracles, even though they are tarot. And to me, that's kind of a non-traditional thing. Like if the tarot becomes optional or secondary, then I feel like that's kind of non-traditional. Like I feel like Wade would like roll over in his grave if he knew we were taking his, you know, beloved system and just like throwing it out the window and going, I'm just going to read it this way. Right.
Yeah. Definitely. Sense. And to me, in some ways, it's a different impressive art form in and of itself, because the only other thing I have got a deck that will fall into that I'll pick next, that's where it feels like it can be secondary. But the other thing I was thinking, if it wasn't the archetypes, it reminds me of the Weavers. And again, that's just an oracle. So you can tell it has that. Yeah. And I think that is equally as impressive, to have been able to still infuse it with a tarot if one chooses, but have this whole other experience with it.
Yeah, it makes for a really rich, multi-layered style of deck, I think. So what's your deck that follows it?
So my third deck, which I feel like is probably the one that fits in with what you were saying the most about it, sort of the tarot can lift out of it, is the 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃. I have lots of fun with this one. You know, like you said, you can get the Black Madonna out and pull tarot around it. I've still not found like a great match for it yet in terms of tarot. I think it's because I used other very visual decks. And I think that to create a language between these beautiful visuals, which, as you can see, it's not an animal deck, believe it or not. There we go. Yeah. It's got sort of an archetype or a symbol or an object, whatever word fits for the thing, one of those per card, and that's it. And you can see like the title is much larger for what we're seeing, so the spell, than it is the 10 of Cups, which is far smaller. There's nothing recognizable for the most part about this. It's so non-traditional, it's so focused in, and I think a pip deck would probably be a better, for me anyway. It was like I tried it with the Anima Mundi Tarot because they were two decks that I was using for the season, and it was too much like visual noise, if that makes sense, and too much animals as well.
Are they photographs? Or I know I've seen it many times, like it's way up at the top of my purchase list. I'm gonna have to just pull the trigger on it, but are they photographs or are they illustrations?
So they're illustrations and they're mixed media. Perfect. What the fun thing is that some of them lean towards one mix of media more than others. I'll see if I can find like a good example, but because of the monochrome on them, it doesn't stand out like that. It feels like a very well finished, very cohesive deck, and yet you can see the art tools that have been used do differ. It's really hard to show because it has to be in person more than anything. Yeah. But like these three, their finishes, this one's quite sketchy. This one feels like this has either been painted or cut out.
Feels like collage.
I don't know about this one. I don't know if this is like a digital art. It looks like it's been finished that way, you know.
It's such a fascinating deck. I really need to get it. I think it would be really fun to play with.
It's so much fun to play with. And actually, since I've had it out for the season, it does have a lot of animals in it, in fairness. Since I've had it out for the season, I've been trying to think up things to do with Patreons inspired by it. And I haven't landed on my concept yet, if that makes sense. But it's so fascinating to me. It's one of those things as well where it's nothing against other decks, but you can tell that it was a labour of love from someone who very much loves the tarot and lives for the system, but just had like a really ingenuitive, creative idea and made it happen. Yes, I've been waiting for this one to come up.
There's the bottle one you're talking about.
So this is the bottle, and this is the Ace of Wands. And it is not because the system isn't traditionally followed. The wands is still the fire suit, but it's actually, when you read this, and I have memorized it from sheer confusion the first few times I saw it, the bottle is like an ink well, and the creator talks about the creativity that sparks our spirit and ignites us from putting the ink in and
Which makes perfect sense.
Beautifully done, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But could you get a Rider-Waite-Smith meaning or Thoth and read it against this? No.
I would go Ace of Cups. If I'm basing it off of that, Ace of Cups, right?
Exactly. It gives Ace of Cups every time over. And my brain, even after having it for a long time, it doesn't roll with the meaning, but every now and then it sees it and it goes, cups, no wands. It's like a really quick, like, whiplash sort of thing. It doesn't read in the same way as perhaps you were describing the Black Madonna, because obviously there's that theme of the Black Madonna throughout, cohesive through that.
Yeah,
it definitely would work as an oracle. And I mean, this writing's so small, people could totally ignore it. And I have enjoyed using it as a tarot, but more because, see, and this is how I know something's non-traditional in my world, is I test how I would get to what I understand as tarot and still make it make sense for what I think initially and intuitively of what I'm seeing, the symbol, the association. And it's like a game of like, how can I weave these two together? Does it still make sense? Is it natural enough to get there, or is it forced? Which in that case, if it's forced, then the deck has kind of failed for me. If it's claiming to still use that system, which this one, I say, seems to do, but it definitely works as an oracle. It definitely works as an archetype, a symbol. And I suppose if I wanted to, although I haven't, some of the decks that I think of off the top of my head are the Memento Mori Oracle and the Black Soul Oracle, which are both object and symbol decks. This is the closest tarot that I've ever had to anything like that. And I don't think anything's renamed, because my assumption is that he probably didn't want to add any other levels of confusion.
Right. Yeah.
It's a really emotive, beautifully curated deck, which has a lot of personal flavour too. I feel like this is one that I can hold up and say, this is non-traditional, and 99% of people will agree.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's not all of them. If anyone thinks this is traditional, by all means, tell us.
Definitely let us know. Yeah.
It's so for you. But it's the first one I thought of when we said we were going to do this video, Hide Tarot.
Yeah. It was the first one I thought of from your collection. Yeah. I'm like, oh yeah, Teen's got the Hide Tarot. She's good.
If I was looking at how can I maximize the most out of one deck, that's one of them. Like,
yeah, you could use that for all kinds of things.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Very cool.
Very cool. It's going to the top of my list now. I've been eyeing it for a long time. Like, I really need to get that because it's gonna be fun to play with. See, the pusher in me wants you to get it, because then I'm like, then we can talk about it. Yes. This is why creators all buy the same deck, right? So we can talk about it, so we can have conversations about it. It's so fun to experience a deck collectively with other people. I honestly encourage people to do it. You don't have to be in person. We have so much access to videos and chats and stuff nowadays. So fun. It is so fun, yeah. And if you've never done readings with a friend, that's really fun too. Yes. Yeah. Oh, so you need it, Dawn. I do. I need it. So we could do readings together. That would be really fun. Awesome. Number 3, not that they're not really in any sort of order. I chose the Tarot of the 𝗕. It has its own system, in my opinion, in a sense. It does follow the 78 cards of a tarot deck, but the way that this particular deck interprets those 78 cards is very unique to this deck. The art really steps outside of a lot. I mean, you can see the influences. There's actually kind of a Thoth-y influence to this card, I feel like. And you can see those influences there if you're looking for them, and particularly if you know what you're looking for. But this is another one of those that works really beautifully intuitively, because I think you can work really well off the art. And I'll be honest, the first time I saw this deck, I was like, I don't know what is up with that art. It's weird. Like, is it weird? Like, and to me, it's an alien deck. So I've developed a whole relationship with this deck. It has a whole personality to me. This, to me, even though it's Tarot of the She, and I've had some really
alien.
It's alien, right? I've had some really interesting conversations with people about, there is a I don't know if you call it a belief or what, but topic of conversation that she is alien as well. But I'm like, this to me is not a fae deck. This to me is my alien deck. It feels very alien. It feels very otherworldly. And so when we're looking at also things like the Rider-Waite-Smith in particular, in that imagery, particularly in the minor arcana, it's very everyday, right? It has recognizable things in it. This to me is so far outside my everyday. It's like where my spirit wants to like live, right? Like go travel the cosmos and meet weird alien people. Deck is so interesting because on top of that, there's this weird otherworldly sort of cosmic thing, but it's also very like primal and earthy, but not in terms of like earth where we live, but earthy in terms of like very grounded and rooted and primal and like almost like animalistic in a way. Also, all the suits have been renamed. The majority of the majors have been renamed and their meanings shift slightly. So I feel like this one is kind of an example of like when we take that system that is there, but we completely reimagine not only just the art, but in a sense, the structure as well, because most of it has been renamed. If you're looking at like this one is like the the Dreamer Princess. And then all of them in the minor arcana also have keywords at the bottom, but they're not like keywords. They're like oracle messages. So like, this is the gift of telling. I'll find my camera again. This is the gift of charm. So you could read it like an oracle too. We're still kind of in that same space, but it's really interesting to me. I really didn't like this deck when I first saw it. I'll be honest. I was like, what's up with that weird artwork? I don't get that deck. I don't get it. I have 2 copies of it. That's how much I like it. I have this copy, which I have trimmed. So I took this one down. You can kind of tell by the backs because they're a little bit wonky. It had big black borders around it. So I trimmed them down and I edged it. But then I also have a copy that is completely cut down to just the artwork without any of the titles so that I can work with it strictly intuitively. And with that version of it, I completely throw out any sort of tarot when I'm working with it. I work with it like you would work with reflecting on just a piece of art.
Yeah.
Personally, depending on whether I grab this one that has the titles on it, is because I want to work with the titles that are included in this system and the messages. Also, the guidebook is very poetic and it's beautiful and great messages in it. Definitely, I don't think one for beginners, but then if I want to just completely throw out anything, then I grab my other copy of it that's completely trimmed down to just the art. And then I work with it very intuitively in a very specific way. And so it has that kind of that fluidity about it. It's kind of similar to some of the other ones that we've talked about, but I feel like that one, the art it's so far outside.
It's interesting, isn't it? And when you were saying it's like otherworldly, but it's also of the earth. And I was thinking, yeah, I can see the of the earth bit as well, but like of the earth before humans hit the earth, kind of.
Yeah. It's not like our earth. It's like it's like earthy in a weird otherworldly. I love it because it's weird. It's weird. Yeah. But it's one of those decks that seeing it online and even hearing people talk about it, but seeing it online, I was like, I don't know what you people see in that deck. I don't get it. I don't get it at all. But when I got it and I started working with it, which is why sometimes I will go ahead and get a deck. That one's also mass market. I think everything else I've shown so far is indie, which that's a whole thing in itself, right? That one is mass market. It's readily available. And when it comes to decks like that, I'm like, I'm willing to give it a try because there have been so many experiences that I've had in my last several years of more moving into being like a tarot collector as well, that I'm like, I want to experience it. I want to try it. And if it doesn't work, then I'll move it on to somebody else. But that's one of them that like I had to get it in my hands, had to work with it before I even remotely got what was going on with that deck. Because I was like, I don't know what's up with this weird art.
I have looked at decks and had very visceral no responses to them. Like, no, that's not for me. Like, it's great. And I get why other people like them. But at the time, I'm very certain that it's not going to work for me. And years can pass, and then suddenly it's like my ears will prick up.
Something will click, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll move on. So yeah, right, it's my number 4. That's it. I don't know why I'm swapping those cards over. There's boobs and things on my channel all the time. We like the boobs, we like the
It's
peens.
art. Yeah.
So it promptly and swiftly takes me into the 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃 Tarot. And for anyone who is curious and thinking that this looks unfamiliar, it is purely because it is the 2nd edition. I haven't trimmed it. My hands are not reliable enough for that, even if I had something to help me. I mean, this in itself is a great example. I am definitely going to invite you to give some opinions about this as well, because I feel like sometimes I lack the language. Like for me, one of the things about non-traditional decks as well is it's the feeling and the experiential part of it that clicks, that helps it sort of like, yes, this is non-traditional. And I feel like I never did the 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃 justice. It's kind of some beautiful system of its own that's like amalgamated many systems, but also it's got all these cultural layers, it's got all these fantasy and lore layers, it's got all these religious layers. It has so many layers packed into each card that inherently it is its own thing by definition, because it has mixed so many things. And I stopped on this. I feel like that as a 7 of Wands is a very quick insight into why it isn't a traditional deck, but it feels like it's not only the artwork, it is a lot of the information that is in the book. Like the book is something else, is it not?
The book is something else, yeah. I did not, like, I saw that deck around. That was one that, like, when I first started seeing around, like, I can appreciate it from an art standpoint, but I don't get it. Yeah. And it didn't really do anything for me. And it turned so many people off, but the Hierophant in the original version with the 2 aliens, if my office wasn't such a mess, I would pull out my 1st edition, but I don't know where it is right this 5 seconds. So, but like, that's another deck that I have 2 copies of the 1st edition. So I have the original with all the borders and everything. And then I have one that's trimmed completely down to the art. And that one, when I first saw that card, I was like, I don't even know what's going on. I was really sad to see it was changed in the 2nd edition. I understand why, but I really was sad because I did so much work with that card, coming to terms with that card. And to me, for that to be the Hierophant, which is one of the cards that I had the most trouble coming around with on the Rider-Waite-Smith interpretation of it, I really, really struggled with that originally. And for that card to be so like in my face and just like throwing at me everything that I was unprepared. It was such a shadow card for me in that deck. And I did so much work with it, but it really took for me actually making the dedicated effort to read the guidebook and actually study the cards alongside the guidebook, because otherwise I didn't get the tarot associations at all. For the most part, it wasn't even like I could make a case for it, right? Yeah. It is a blend of all the systems though. Yeah. If you read the guidebook and then you really do dive into the cards, you can see the influences from both Rider-Waite-Smith and Thoth. They're it's very heavily in there, but there's so many other layers.
Like these discs, I feel is very Thothy.
It's very Thothy.
There's just something about it. It's so interesting because I hated that Hierophant so much, but for same reasons. Not so much the Hierophant part of it, but just my brain's like
the imagery. No. Yeah, the imagery is very confronting, but I love that that's the point of it, right? Which is why I was so sad to see it change.
I would love to own now a copy of the 1st edition, because now I'm in a space and I do feel like it's in its time and place as well. I didn't get this when everyone was encouraging me to, and they'd already had it for ages. Like I feel like this has been out for a while, even when I re-entered the tarot. Oh, and here was my shadow card from the deck. So it's but there was something as well about the indulgence of this, that it's not fully human, that there's this kind of I laugh and I say, this is Mr. Tumnus when no one else is around, basically. And it took this childhood thing that I have.
Right.
Yeah. And suddenly Mr. Tumnus is in a whole different light now.
It's a whole different way to see it. Yeah.
This is the line, the witch, the wardrobe, and the kink. Like, it's something about the lust, the luxuriating, just something I don't offer myself very often, you know. And
It's like, it's tastefully vulgar.
yes, it is.
But it's tastefully vulgar.
It's so beautifully drawn.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful.
And I'm very thankful for it. And I hated it for ages, hated from afar, wasn't into it, didn't understand, felt like people were part of some weird 𝗕𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 cult.
Yeah.
And then I got it, and I just think it's glorious. And in terms of representation, now there is a lot more. But in and of its time, realms beyond with the representation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which we, again, did not see. This, absolutely beautiful. And I just think that it was something that brought me back to art and brought me out of the way that sort of I felt like media had kind of trained my brain at certain points. But in terms of like the traditional tarot meanings, I did spend a lot of time with the book, but I got it and it sat there for ages on the altar. When I eventually got it, I was like, and then I started reading with it, and the allowing myself to first just experience it, then go to the book. And as you say, when you go to the book, you start to see the meanings if you already know the systems quite well. But they're amalgamated, and there's like a poetic, but all of those sort of occult layers, the religious layers, the other stuff, it's a really interesting amalgamation, but it's very direct about it. It's not pretend. It's out there. It's like, this is what I am, like it or lump it. And there is mostly, I feel, nothing familiar except from, and this is the sad part, this card does genuinely make me sad, because I feel like they forced her to do it. Now, I don't know, so I can't speak for it. But the Three of Swords original is a white bird falling from the sky, right?
Yeah, that card and the Change of the Hierophant, when I got the second edition, I went, nope, back you go. I'm done.
Yeah.
I don't know the story either, but it definitely does feel like it was a card that was made because it had to be. Like, that to me is kind of shows the shadowy side of mass market producing these decks and taking it mainstream. Those challenging cards though, like those, just in art in general, or anything that challenges us, that pushes us back, that is so important to personal growth. Like, you got to be able to face the things that make you uncomfortable at some point. I mean, there's healthy ways to do it. You can speak to this way better than I can, but like, it's so important. And to pull them out of a deck, it's so sad. Now my number 4, speaking of decks that I was like, nope. The first time I saw it, the second time I saw it, the third time I saw it, the 20th time I saw it is, oh, I love that this is the card I pulled up first. Yep. So this is, I can't find my camera. So this is the Nicoletta Ceccoli. So I pulled this one out as a non-traditional, as an example of non-traditional for a very specific reason, and because this is a deck that's created out of curated art. So this is pre-existing art that they then took and created a tarot around it. And I'm not saying that in a disparaging way in any way, shape, or form. I just think that the idea of taking something that already exists and then applying the tarot meaning to it is an interesting sort of non-traditional take on how to, on creating a deck. This deck for me, when I first saw it, no, what is up with these dolls? I can't, like I did creepy. And then I had a dream. About one of these dang little dolls. And it wasn't even because I went through and I couldn't get it out of my mind. It was very specifically one of these types of dolls. There was a very specific image that happened in this dream. And I was like hunting online as like, have I seen that somewhere? Does it exist in the deck? I couldn't find it online. So I was like, it's mass market. I'm just going to buy the stupid deck so I can look and see if this damn card is in there. It's not. It's not.
You made it up.
I made it up, and it's kind of like it was a representation of this deck. And then once I had it, I was like, okay, so there's something with this dream and this deck. And I have been on a full-on journey with this deck. There are videos on my channel where this is my second copy. I have 3 copies of this deck. So I have this one. I have one that I completely trimmed down and reordered my own version of tarot to it. I actually made a new card for it because using Nicoletta 𝗕𝗄𝗯𝗀𝗆's art. So I made a new card for it and created my own version of tarot using it. Did a whole journal, wrote a whole thing about it. It was a whole experience that I went through with this deck. Now I absolutely love it. Now it sits in a very particular space for me. This is my wounded child deck. This is whenever I'm doing work, not inner child work, very specifically wounded child work, childhood trauma work. So when I'm doing anything around that or anything comes up around that, this is the deck that I go to, which is all very personal stuff, which is why you hardly ever see it in any of my videos, because that's incredibly personal, very, very sensitive work that I do with it. But I use it all the time, anytime any sort of thing happens around that sort of topic. And it took me all of that work though with it to be able to kind of find its place in my practice. But as a non-traditional deck, I was holding it up as one because the artwork was not made for the tarot. The tarot was applied to the artwork. And again, not saying that in a bad way. We had a discussion, you mentioned the 𝗵𝘁𝗍𝗄𝗃 tarot is similar.
It's an interesting challenge, isn't it, as well, to set. And I feel like they've done a really good job of it. But I also remember watching your content when you were doing the deck and you had your journal that you went along with it for, and seeing your choices, they still made sense to me. And that's the funny thing about those. I feel like it's easier to see in those ones where, like you said, the tarot's already there and then you've got to fit the artwork to it. Is that actually, because we all perceive the tarot in various ways, they put it there, but for some of us, it would actually fit more in this card and that one in that card. And that in itself for me makes it very non-traditional, because it would be really hard to stick the 3 of Swords with that heart and the daggers anywhere else.
And some of them did overlap for me. And it's not that I didn't agree with the associations and the choices, because I actually have in my journal the little white book. Because I actually think the little white book is actually really, really great. I really enjoy it. And I do, when I was working with it, trying to find my own way with it, I did, kind of pull that in too. But the process of it was more about personalizing the deck for me, and to figure out, again, confronting those things that I have a visceral reaction to this deck for a reason. There's something about this deck that challenges me, and I want to know what it is. I want to face it. I want to know what it is. And now it's it's a staple in my actual, not when I'm goofing around with decks, right? And I'm playing dice and making little quests or whatever. But when I'm actually doing real deep and dirty work, that's one of those foundational decks for me.
Which I can relate to, because that's where the 𝗵𝗍𝗄𝗃 sits for me. Not so much personally associated with that type of level of specificity. I could pull a card out and just look at it. But I don't do it because it just doesn't feel right. It just doesn't make sense to me in my relationship with that deck. And those decks, they, like you say, they end up often enough being confronting in a way that can really shift something if you work with decks in that way, if you're looking for that developmental challenge. And definitely, it's not my, I'm just having fun deck. No way. I actually slept on the Ceccoli for too long. It touches something, and I have a very similar experience of that sort of more of a spectrum of child with I'm pointing because they're behind me, that's why. With Jasmine Beckett Griffith's artwork. So quite a powerful worker for you then in particular.
But I had, I had to put the time and effort into it.
Yes.
That's kind of the thing.
And do you feel like that's a common theme with your non-traditional decks as well throughout?
I mean, when I'm looking at the ones that I selected, except for my last one that I have, but the rest of them that I've selected, they've all, required me to actually put some time and effort into. Like, they don't just out of the box work. I do have a couple that I feel like they out of the box work for me, but not in a traditional tarot way.
Yeah.
So
I would agree. And funny enough, exactly the same. The one I'm about to show, which is my last one, was fine out of the box. But the rest of them, I have done various different levels of dedicated work with to get to the mergence of what is traditional to me, what is not, where they land, and get all of that juicy, intuitive stuff that they offer on their own. So it does seem to be a theme through that non-traditional, like, you want to work with me, you have to work for it.
You have to earn it. I'm worth it. You just have to earn it. Yeah.
So my last one, I feel like, is a more obviously talked about one, but it feels like because of that, it earned its spot. Dawn and I were talking and we were like, the Wildwood Tarot it's one that has come up over the years a lot. So if people aren't familiar with it, they will see it from YouTubers, especially because 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗯𝘀, the artist, did a much more traditional deck with different creators, which is the Druid Craft. I used to have the Druid Craft and I actually parted with it. I was going through one of those phases of, I don't need it, I'm not using it, so I'm going to part with it. Actually, I loved the artwork and it was an easy reader as well, but I did tend to, when I wanted that art, I would fall back to this one. I think the thing that we were both saying about this, again, animals and cults. So firstly, enter the animals, which seems to be one of the most common themes for people sort of just having a bit more of a time with it. It does do renames, although they are somewhat familiar. So vessels instead of cups, stones instead of pentacles, not the most out there, but also it does have its own system. I talk about why I say this in the review, so I'm only going to do a short sort of version of it. I still think when I went through this, and I went through it with the mindset of what system does it remind me of the most, which was the ரிder-Waite-Smith. How much of the deck can I see the ரிder-Waite-Smith in enough, either definitely through the artwork, but also in the echoes of what the book says. I feel like a fair 50% of this deck shows up in a very familiar way, but there is also a good portion of it that doesn't. And I think one of the things that makes it maybe an easier non-traditional deck is then you get to the fact that they've got keywords at the bottom.
They've got keywords, yeah.
So this is the 8 of stones and it says skill, which arguably to me that does give me 8 of pentacles.
That totally gives 8 of pentacles vibes. Yeah.
Because of mastery. Whereas 9 of stones, tradition. The artwork, see, I can get there with quicker. The keyword is interesting. And then I wonder if I'll be able to find it. But I think the card that really stands out, and is the first one for me to say to people, look, if you haven't already read the book, because the book will tell you, it's very seasonally based. It looks at this and the equinox. It has a lot of, I think it's fair to say, paganism at least. There's like sort of pagan, druid, people could even argue Wiccan and witchy facets to this deck, but the wheel of the year is that dominant part. And if you go through and read the book, it will help you understand why you're seeing certain seasons in certain suits, what's happening.
The wheel of the year is what provides the structure.
Yes, and it does it really well. Like
it does it really well. Yeah. It does it really well, but it's not the 78 card structure in the way that we normally see it.
Yes, and you are required to read the book perhaps a few times before it really starts to like sink in. And sort of, I feel like my advice with this deck is always trust the artwork, if nothing else, because I don't memorize the decks. I learn the system, I get to know it, it's fun, I enjoy the study. But at the end of the day, I'm trusting the artwork, I'm trusting my intuition, I'm trusting what I know. I don't like to force messages onto the artwork that don't make sense, which is why I have a plethora of decks.
Yeah.
And so the 5 of Cups in 𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗃, 3 broken at the front, 2 at the back that aren't broken, head down, very somber mood, 5s very challenging. This 5 of Cups, 5 of Vessels, ecstasy. We have pentagram, we have just ecstatic dance ritual going on. It gives nothing 𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗃. From my recollection, not anything 𝗵𝘁 based either. I'm trying to remember the keywords.
I don't think so. I'm trying to remember.
In a fun way, it works for me with the 5s in that ecstasy is such a heightened state. It's just a heightened state in the opposite direction of what we generally tend to talk about in the 5s. But it's something
still going to create that shakeup.
Yeah. And it's something you can't keep up with either. And that in itself, it's so extreme that if other people aren't in this state with you, that in itself creates friction, because it's like, well, I'm in this state, so don't put out my fire. Sort of
right.
But it's, I think that's where it catches people, because there are some cards that feel familiar if you know some Golden Dawn stuff. And then you come to it and you're like, oh, well, that makes sense, but it's sort of going in its own nuance. And then you get to the renames, which we have, again, some more familiar than the others. The Green Woman is the Empress, the Hooded Man is the Hermit. I used to confuse Justice and Strength for a while, because both depictions remind me of Strength. Here we go. So the Woodward, I can never say it, Woodward.
Woodward, yeah.
This is a Strength card. So it's 11. The Stag, which to me also I can get to Strength straight away, is their version of the Justice card, which I can see. But it's funny because I guess, and I'll be honest, it's the animals and the presentation of both that take me to Strength and my association. So I think that there are a lot of challenging points in this deck that sort of take us there. And when I went through it, like I say, I was trying to help people make some familiarity with it. I certainly never, which I don't think I remember to mention in the review, and tripped maybe a few people up, I never meant to say it was a 𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗃 deck, nor that we should force the system on it, because that just doesn't make sense to me. But that it's an interesting amalgamation from people who clearly knew the systems of tarot. They then brought this wonderful Wheel of the Year structure into it, which when you read that, it makes total sense, and it throws our need to associate with other systems out of the window.
My first real experience working with that deck, so I got it, and I think I trimmed it. I think I tried to reback it, and I think that didn't go so well. So I think I've had multiple copies of it. But when I first got it, I was like, okay, well, this has a system of its own, and I don't really feel like learning it right now. So where that deck ended up for me for the longest time is actually, it's my deck my druid in my D&D campaign uses, and we don't use any sort of tarot association with it. We just work off the card imagery, and that's part of her character.
Awesome.
And so that's where it ended up for the longest time. It's still there. It's still in my little druid pack when I play that character. But I do have a regular copy of it, because then I was like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to learn the system. And that's another one of those decks that, like, I had to be ready to actually take the time to work with it. I did the Wheel of the Year in the Wildwood thing. Yeah. That little book, I followed it. And because that really makes it very clear that you're not following the structure from the traditional sort of from the Golden Dawn system, because you're not following the hero's journey.
No.
You're following the Wheel of the Year. It's a totally different foundation. So it was interesting. It was really fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I do still work with it on occasion, but it was one of those that, like, I had to definitely decide that I was willing to put the time and effort into learning the system. I think that it's one of those that, like, the reason I took the borders off of it the first time was like, I'm just going to work with it intuitively and just work with the artwork for a while, which I did. And that was fun too. But I do generally like to know, like, if somebody took the time to make a whole system for it, eventually I kind of want to learn it. That doesn't mean that I won't throw parts of it out if they don't work for me, because I'm reading for myself. So if it doesn't work for me, I'm not going to use it. But that was one that definitely took me a lot of time and effort, and actually just started off as a gaming deck for the longest time. Like, it's still there. We still use it on occasion, but yeah, that's where it started.
It's a whole different relationship that you have with it, and then you have the other one at a later date as well, and that's still really cool.
Yeah. Speaking of like D&D fandom-y things, right? My last deck is actually the Star Trek Tarot. Okay, so this one I chose. It follows the 𝗕𝗿𝗻𝗀𝗻 mostly. The imagery, you're not, I think for the most part, you're not going to get 𝗕𝗿𝗻𝗀 out of these images. The thing that's really interesting about this, and why I chose it as a non-traditional deck, is because this is an example to me of decks that use other media and other, in a sense, structures to explore the tarot. Because this deck, every card relates to an episode. So you can use the episodes. So the title of the episode is down here. You can use the title of the episodes and pull that energy in, as well as the tarot. So it's exploring the tarot through this already established system or world of Star Trek. And so it's exploring it in that way. I think I hope that this creator does the next generation, because like I grew up with this, but like that one's my favorite one. So I hope they do it, because that other one is that Inside Edition did is terrible, and like I don't even have it anymore. This is a gorgeously created deck. The thought, the energy, the intention. This is a true fan-made deck. Also, fully licensed fan decks. That's a pet peeve of mine. And so the creator does actually have permission from the intellectual property owner to create this deck. So I think that's really important with fan decks. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting, because if you take a deck, and I think that could really apply to any sort of, I'm going to call them fan decks for, or fan-based decks for lack of a better thing, but decks based on shows or, movies. Or I could have actually pulled the tabletop tarot is an interesting example of that, because it's very clearly 𝗕𝗿𝗻𝗀𝗻 in the way that it depicts the images, but it uses the language of D&D to express those energies, which I think is really interesting.
It's very clever as well, isn't it? Like, I know we've said it a lot with these selection of decks, and I'm not saying that other decks aren't impressive, and they're impressive in their own ways, but I feel like some of the things that occur in a good, solid, non-traditional tarot deck, the extra layers, the extra structures, the links to the stories, the fact that you can literally have an immersive experience with that Star Trek one. I'm looking forward to hearing what people firstly think of our non-traditional, and secondly, agree, don't agree. Like, we want to hear it, just don't be a dick about it, but share your opinions and tell us like what you think is one of your most non-traditional decks as well.
Yeah, because we love non-traditional decks. So if you got some suggestions, we definitely want to hear them.
Bring.
Yep.
Other than that, all the links are going to be in the bit below where they usually are. So if you want to find Dawn and somehow you don't know who she is, then ways to find her glorious membership, to find her channel and all the things. And mine are obviously there. Anything else to add before we finish up?
I don't think so. We're on your channel this time. We'll be on my channel, I think, next time. You'll just have to stay tuned for what we're discussing.
Yes, and keep your requests coming as well.
Yeah. We are compiling a list of requests and topics. Yeah.
Awesome. So we will say bye and see everyone again in a month or so.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.